Okay, this week's Parsha is Parshat Shelach. And the first verse says that God says to Moshe, Shlach lecha anashim. Send men to spy out the land. So from the first verse it says, and God spoke to Moshe saying, send men. But in the Hebrew, there's a very subtle nuance here. It says, Shlach lecha anashim, which you could translate as you should send men. Or as Rashi says, the first thing he says is, ledatcha. If you want to send, send. I am not commanding you. So people ask, well, why does Rashi have to say this? Because you could read it very easily that God is telling Moshe what to do. Shlach lecha anashim. You should send men. But instead, in a very subtle nuance, Rashi reads it, not just Rashi, that God says, I'm not commanding you. If you want to send, you send. So what is this based on? Again, the word you. That if it was a command, it could have said, Shlach anashim, send men, without the you. Because it has the you, it can be interpreted that way. But there's a more important reason. If you look in the book of Devarim, where Moshe reviews a lot of what has happened to the Jewish people during the 40 years, and he says to them, when he's going over the incident of the spies, he says, you came to me and asked me to send spies. Now, we don't get this in this week's Parsha, but we get it later that it appears that, number one, it wasn't God, what's called lachatchila, at the first instance, commanding Moshe to send. And it's even beyond Moshe coming up with this idea on his own. In other words, the people came to Moshe and said, can we send spies to check out the land? So now going back to the first Rashi, the next part is very enigmatic, paradoxical, and this is what we're going to be talking about almost the whole class. The next part of the Rashi. Rashi says that Moshe took counsel with the Shekhinah. And the Shekhinah said to Moshe, I promised the people to give them a land flowing with milk and honey. I promised to bring them, that's why it's called the promised land. I promised to bring them into the land. Why do they want to send spies? In other words, don't they trust me? Don't they believe that I will do what I promised? Therefore, I will give them an opening to make a mistake with the report that the spies came back, in order that I will not let this generation come into the land. Now, what's the implication of that? If you follow, the implication here is, and that's the question, I'm not sure we can answer it because commentaries have been asking this for quite literally thousands of years. Was that God's plan from the beginning? Was it, if God is saying, I'm giving them the opening to make a mistake, and so that I won't let them into the land, so is that as a reaction to the people's lack of faith or the people's exercise of their free choice? Or was that determined already? Was that determined that God saw that this generation was not ready to come into the land? We see from the spies and how the people, when they heard what the spies had to say, all stood at their tent and cried and said, let's pick a new leader and let's go back to Egypt. So obviously, God sees things before they happen. So is it that this was the plan all the time? Or that it could have been different? The people could not have come to Moshe and asked for spies. They could have come and asked Moshe to send spies, and Moshe refused. There are many, many possibilities here. But in the end, we see what happened. So we are going to delve into this a little bit deeper. But we're also going to look at another Rashi, because after the 12 spies were chosen, one of them was Hoshea bin Nun, better known as Joshua, Yehoshua. But his name wasn't Yehoshua, it was Hoshea. And in the Parsha, it says that Moshe gave him a new name. He added the letter Yud in front of his name, and now he became Yehoshua. And we know him from now on as Yehoshua, but up to this point, he was called Hoshea. Hoshea means from the word to save. And by adding the letter Yud, the Yud is the first letter of God's four-letter name, that Moshe was blessing him or praying for him. This is what Rashi says, that God should save him from the report, the words of the spies. So the plot thickens here. If Moshe is so concerned about the possible report of the spies, so much so that he changes Yehoshua's name, then why did he send him in the first place? So I hope everyone is picking up here that this is a very complicated matter. Now, before we go into it deeper, let's look at the spies. We're told when they were chosen, they were considered kosher and they were great leaders. And Moshe chose them specifically because they were great leaders. So the whole question is, what went wrong here? What went wrong here that they came back with what's called an evil report? But we can ask even deeper. We can ask even deeper that if Moshe suspected them in the first place, why did he go along with it? Moshe was a very strong leader. In upcoming Parshiot, Korach is going to rebel against him. He stands up to Korach and his whole group. Many times the people wanted to stone him. He stood up to the people. He stood up to Pharaoh. And on occasion, he stands up to God. So it's hard to say that Moshe was somewhat weak here. So actually, before we get to the spies, I'm going to continue with Moshe. And again, I'm saying from the first instance, I'm throwing out a lot of ideas. And usually in this kind of case, there's a little bit of truth in almost every opinion. So on one hand, we could say this is a sign of Moshe's weakness. Now that sounds pretty like terrible to say about Moshe, that he had a moment of weakness, but Moshe is a human being. It's the same Moshe who argued with God for a whole week at the burning bush that he didn't feel that he was fitting to be a leader and to lead the Jews. And in last week's Parsha, it's actually astounding that Moshe became so burdened by the people that at one point, literally in the explicit text, he says to God, if this is the way you're going to treat me, kill me now. I can't handle this people by myself. So here we see the Torah itself is showing that Moshe is a human being, a great human being, greater than we can even imagine, the greatest of all prophets, the greatest of all leaders. But Moshe is a human being. So we could say that Moshe thought that he couldn't stand up to the people. The people are asking him to send spies, and he sends spies. There's another possibility, and it's a great answer. And the sages answer it in a parable. What was Moshe's thinking here? And the parable is of someone who wants to buy a donkey. And they go to the owner of the donkey. It's kind of like, we want to buy a car today. So you go to the owner and you say, like, are there any problems with this car? So you would imagine the owner is going to say, no, it runs perfectly. I've never had a problem. We all know that one. But the guy wanting to buy the donkey says to him, well, is he good in the mountains? And is he good in the flatlands? And the owner says, of course he is. And so the person said, well, can I take him for a day and try him out? And the owner says, for sure, go ahead. If that happens, in many instances, we're gonna trust the owner, because if he was willing to give me the car, or in today's terms, I say, can I have it for a day to take it to my mechanic so he can check it out? And the person says, sure. So we probably should take it anyways, if you were smart, but we might trust him. So this mashal is brought down by the sages that perhaps this is how Moshe was thinking. In other words, if he says to the people, sure, we could send spies, and I'm even going to take 12 people, and they're going to schlep for 40 days, and they would say, oh okay, like, if we'll trust you. We'll trust you. We don't need to schlep for 40 days. So that's one possibility. The other one is, like we've all had in life many, many times, where we try to make the best of a situation. Moshe may have thought, if I say, no, you can't send spies, that would like set off alarm bells. Like, why won't he send spies? Is there something that he doesn't want us to see? Is there something that we don't know here? So Moshe is in a sense hoping for the best. That's why he adds a letter to Yeshua's name, like praying that God should strengthen Yehoshua. Let's make the best of the situation. Now we know that from Aaron, if you remember, when they started to wanting to build the golden calf, Aaron tries to stall them. He doesn't stand up and say, you can't do this. This is terrible. This is idol worship. According to the Midrash, Hur actually did that, and the people killed him. So Aaron is like, somewhat, for good reason, scared the people will do the same thing to him. He knows that Moshe is going to come down, so he tries to make the best of the situation, and he stalls them. So this could be what Moshe is doing also. And then there's another possibility, perhaps the deepest one, and probably the closest to truth. Even these other possibilities are possible. The next reason is Moshe is the greatest of the prophets, and he is in tune with the will of God. And now it could even be unclear prophecy, but he sees that God's ultimate will is that this generation isn't fitting to come in. Moshe knows better than anyone. They tried him over and over and over again. And in fact, in this week's parsha, God says they've tested me 10 times. 10 times the people have tested me. Now, of course, if they test God, they're testing Moshe at the same time. So Moshe intuitively, maybe not like consciously, understood that it was God's will that this generation not go in. And therefore, he, in a sense, went along with the Shekhinah, who said, I'm going to give them the opening. So Moshe could have thought, well, if they come back with a good report, great, maybe this is a tshuva that will, in a sense, change the reality. So God will see that this generation is fitting to go in. And if they don't come back with a good report and the people balk at going into the land, obviously this is God's will. So it could be all or a combination of all of these different things. I personally think that the last reason is the closest to, if you want to call it truth, is the closest to how things played out. Now let's look very carefully at the motivation of the Marauding, of the spies. So we could say they were holy people when they went. And the other question is, in a sense, they told the truth. They came, they saw giants, they saw fortified cities like they've never seen before. They saw a fierce people. They, according to the Midrash, there were funerals happening all over the place. And they drew a conclusion that it's a land that eats up its inhabitants. We're told in the Midrash that all these people were dying to distract them, that they didn't notice that there were these 12 strangers wandering around the land for 40 days. But they interpreted it as it's a land that eats its inhabitants. So they actually, in a sense, told the truth. The only thing that they didn't tell the truth is when they said, we can't go in. They're too strong for us. We will not succeed. That was the main thing. The fact that they came back and said they had fortified cities. Moshe gives them a whole list of things to check out. And one of them is, well, what are the cities like? Are they fortified? How strong are the people? So they did their job, but they exhibited bad judgment and they went one step beyond what their calling was. Their calling is just like Yeshua and Caleb. They didn't argue that the people there were very strong. But what they said is God promised it and he will do it. We have to trust. God will bring us in. Then there are other opinions by the sages. Some say they simply lacked faith. And this was the problem with the whole generation that they asked to send spies in the first place. They didn't simply trust that God would lead us in. Another one, which is a little bit more negative, is that there's a possibility that these leaders, excuse me, were afraid that they would lose their positions when they came into Israel. They figure, okay, we're leaders in the desert, but there's no guarantee we'll be leaders in Israel. Right now, we have a position. Why should we take a chance and go into Israel and maybe lose our position? That's a possibility that the sages throw out, that there was very egotistical on their part. very self-centered. They weren't looking after the people whatsoever. They were looking after their own position. Now, unfortunately, I know people are watching from all over. It doesn't matter where. This is the typical story of politicians today. People have lost so much trust in our leaders because it's almost assumed. Doesn't mean that it's always true, but it's always assumed that if someone's going into politics, they must have some self-interest in it, even though it doesn't necessarily come to fruition like that. But unfortunately, there are so many scandals, so many scandals. It's like, what else are people supposed to think these days? Then Chassidut brings a different reason altogether. And Chassidut talks about this a lot, that they didn't want to come into Eretz Yisrael because in the desert, we had like a protective lifestyle. We were being fed the manna every day. We're told that our clothes didn't wear out. We had a pillar of fire and a cloud surrounding us and protecting us. If we go into Israel, we have to work. And in the desert, what are we doing? We're sitting by Moshe Rabbeinu and learning Torah. That is what we're doing. We're living this very, very spiritual, non-material lifestyle. We come into Israel, we have to build cities and we have to plant and we have to work. Maybe it's better for us to maintain a spiritual existence. This is also a possibility spoken about in Chassidut. And then they actually go one more step, in a sense, trying to defend the motivations of the spies, that in last week's Parsha, after Moshe says, God, if this is the way you're going to treat me, kill me. And God says, no. I will give you 70 elders and I will take part of your ruach and I'll put it on them and they will assist you. So God understood Moshe. And we're told that the 70 elders began to prophesy because God took some of the prophetic power of Moshe and gave it to the elders. And then it says that there were two elders, Eldad and Medad, and they also were prophesying. And then Yeshua runs to Moshe and says, they're prophesying, shut them up. And Moshe answers a very classic statement saying, are you jealous for me? Would it be that all of the people of God were prophets? So it's an amazing statement. It could be a whole class in of itself, what that means. But the question is, what was Yeshua so upset about? And why did Moshe say, are you jealous for me? So the sages bring down what their prophecy was. What were they saying? Moshe is going to die, and Yeshua is going to lead the people into Israel. It was a correct prophecy. And Yeshua, who was the most loyal student, he didn't want to hear that his teacher was going to die and he was going to bring the people in. That's the last thing that he wanted. But Moshe said, are you jealous for me? If this is God's will, then that's God's will. So this idea was already in the world. So Chassidut explains, as a possibility that the spies knew that if we came into Israel, what would happen to Moshe? He would die. And what are we going to do without Moshe Rabbeinu? Let's stay in the desert and Moshe will stay alive. So that's also thrown out as a possibility. So here you see we have many possibilities that are given. Some are very positive, some are very negative. And to try to discern, well, what is the true story here? In a case like this, in a sense, because these are all statements by great commentaries. So in a sense, each person has their perspective in the Torah and has to try to understand this according to their own perspective. But now I want to get back in the few minutes that we have left to this deeper question as to the synergy between free will and God's omnipotence. If God knows everything before it happens, knows the future, then God knows already that they're going to come back with an evil report. And so the classic question is, if God knows this, how could it be different? And then we're stuck with this idea, well, there's really no free will then, because God knows everything in advance. So this is a huge subject. The Rambam says, if all of the oceans were ink, it would not be enough to write about this issue of free will and God's omnipotence, God's providence. But in this week's Parsha, and I'm just leaving everyone with the thought to try to figure out for ourselves what exactly happened here. So, in modern science, there's this idea called parallel universes, where things play out the way they play out. But what about all the possibilities of what could have happened? So the idea of parallel universes is, in a certain level, each and every possibility is true and has its own cause and effect. So in other words, you have parallel universes where, like, all these motivations of Moshe, each one of them, in a sense, can play itself out. Each of the motivations of the spies plays itself out. But then you say, well, we only have one reality here. But reality is very, I used the word before, nuanced. There's lots of gray in this world if we're trying to say, well, which of the motivations of the spies is the true one? Well, it's not so simple to answer that. And this Rashi, which implies that this was God's will, that this generation was not fitting to come in, but we still have the question, well, where does free will come in? And that's why the Rashi is saying, I will give them the opening to make a mistake here in order that they shouldn't come into the land. But the implication further is, what happens if they came back with a good report? And they said, yes, we can do it. Would all of reality have changed? Well, on a certain level, we believe that that's true. Because if not, free will is an illusion, is almost not a real possibility. And we believe very strongly in that free will is real. So the idea, the wording of Rashi, that I'll give them the opening, the possibility, is implying that they could have chosen differently. We can understand this when, after the golden calf, God says to Moshe, please move to the side and I will destroy the people and I will make a new people from you. this is like an amazing offer. Moshe can become the new Avraham. God is going to make a whole new people from Moshe. And the same people that are already complaining, it's like, Moshe could say, what do I need this for? Yeah, let God start a new people from me. But Rashi says that the wording is, please move to the side. What did Moshe understand from that? Well, if I don't stand to the side, then God won't destroy the people. And that's exactly what Moshe did. He spoke up and said, God, if you're going to do this thing, you can wipe me out of the book that you've written. I'll have no part of this. So here God is saying, I'm going to destroy the people. Moshe stands up and God says, okay, I relent. So how free will and God's providence and omnipotence works is, of course, one of the greatest mysteries and paradoxes. We've just barely touched on it, but with the information that I've given over and the different possibilities, we all have what to contemplate. And of course, we'll now open this up to comments and questions. But we'll end with a blessing. We'll end with a blessing because we're told that the sin of speaking bad about Israel. And actually, I want to add one thing at the end here, a very, very important thing. It's very easy for us to judge the spies. It's very, very easy for us to judge the generation that said, let's choose new leaders and go back to Egypt. But with all due respect, how many people have contemplated or wanted to or felt like that they would like to come to Israel to live? But this stands in the way, and this stands in the way, and how am I going to do this? And what will happen if that? And maybe I won't succeed. And what about my job? And it goes on and on and on. So the story of the spies is not about other people. And we could even take it away from Israel. How many times do we doubt our own intuition? Or we really want to do something. We know it's the right thing to do. We should do it, but we just don't have the emotional strength, the intellectual power behind us to make a decision, and we don't do it. But since this is all about Israel, if you remember that when after the Babylonian exile, and we were given permission to come back to Israel, if you read the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, only 40,000 Jews came back, which was a very small amount. And here we could say in Israel, we're almost 75 years old, and still a majority of Jews live outside of Israel. So we shouldn't jump too quickly to judge the generation of the desert, because that generation, it's us. Each of us in our own lives, and in particular the whole Jewish people, about commitment and conviction about Israel. So I just want to end with a bracha that whether someone comes to Israel or doesn't come to Israel, don't speak bad about Israel. That's like bottom line. And unfortunately, not only is the whole world speaking bad about Israel now. But unfortunately, you have many, many Jews also. It's like, war crimes, and it's quite unbelievable. So the lesson for all of us, whether we come to Israel, we don't come to Israel, don't speak bad about Israel. Israel has plenty of things that it needs to fix. No one hides that. We have plenty of work to do. But there's a big difference of acknowledging that and trashing Israel. So we should remember this, and we should give it over to our contemporaries as well.